My name is Joaquin Herrera. I'm a court bailiff who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. 3 days ago, I was maintaining order in a Los Angeles courthouse. Now I'm barricaded in a security office, surrounded by infected, recording this while I still can. The government has abandoned us. The infected are getting smarter, and I'm running out of time to warn you about what's coming. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Herrera, but everyone at the courthouse calls me Javi. I'm a bailiff for the Los Angeles County Superior Court, and I've been keeping order in those courtrooms for 8 years now. Before that, I spent 4 years as a corrections officer, dealing with some of the most dangerous people you can imagine. I'm also a certified EMT, something I maintain on my own time because I believe in being prepared to help people when they need it most. I'm recording this from the fourth-floor security office of the downtown courthouse. It's been 3 days since everything started, and I need to tell you what happened because what I witnessed here, what I learned, might be the difference between your survival and becoming one of them. This isn't some Hollywood movie or video game. This is real, and it's spreading faster than anyone in government wants to admit. Tuesday morning, September 15th, started like any other day in my 8 years on the job. I arrived at the courthouse at 6 in the morning, just like always. The building was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of early morning traffic outside. I punched in my security code and began my routine walkthrough of the building, something I've done thousands of times before. The first thing that struck me as odd was that Mike, our night security guard, had called in sick. Mike hadn't missed a shift in the 2 years I'd known him. He was one of those guys who came to work even when he probably should have stayed home. When I checked the log, I saw he'd called in around 2 in the morning, complaining of severe stomach problems and what he described as confusion. At the time, I just figured he'd picked up some kind of bug. I made my way through the building, checking doors, ensuring all security systems were functioning properly. Everything seemed normal until I got to the holding cells in the basement. That's where I first encountered Rico Vasquez, the defendant who was scheduled for arraignment that morning on armed robbery charges. I'd seen plenty of agitated defendants before, people facing serious time who couldn't sleep or were dealing with withdrawal, but Rico was different. When I brought him his breakfast tray at 7 o'clock, he was pressed against the back wall of his cell, scratching at his forearms so intensely that he'd drawn blood. His eyes were bloodshot, not from crying or lack of sleep, but in a way that reminded me of severe allergic reactions I'd seen during my EMT training. He kept mumbling in Spanish, but it wasn't coherent, just fragments of words repeated over and over. I tried talking to him in both English and Spanish, asking if he needed medical attention. That's when he looked directly at me for the first time, and I'll never forget what I saw in his eyes. It wasn't fear or anger or even the resignation you sometimes see in career criminals. It was something wild, primitive, like looking into the eyes of a cornered animal that's decided it has nothing left to lose. By 8:30, I was upstairs preparing courtroom 7 for the morning docket. Judge Martinez was scheduled to preside, and in all my years working her courtroom, she had never been late. She was the kind of judge who arrived early, stayed late, and treated every case with the same level of attention whether it was a traffic violation or murder one. When 9 o'clock came and went without any sign of her, I called her office. No answer. I tried her cell phone, straight to voicemail. That's when I started noticing other absences. Public Defender Johnson, who was supposed to represent Rico, hadn't shown up either. Neither had 2 of the prosecutors scheduled for morning cases. Mrs. Chen, our court reporter, mentioned that she'd gotten calls from 3 different attorneys asking to postpone their cases due to illness in their families. The morning news was playing on the small television in the clerk's office, and I caught fragments of reports about water contamination issues in several neighborhoods and hospitals, reporting unusually high numbers of patients with what they were calling acute gastroenteritis. The reporters seemed confused, mentioning that the symptoms were more severe than typical food poisoning, and that patients were becoming increasingly agitated and difficult to treat. I remember thinking about the water fountain I'd used Monday morning when I arrived early for overtime paperwork. The water had tasted slightly off, metallic, but I dismissed it as old pipes. Now I wonder if that was the beginning of everything that followed. By 10 o'clock, we'd managed to postpone 3 cases because the required parties hadn't appeared. The few people in the gallery seemed increasingly nervous, constantly checking their phones and whispering among themselves. Mrs. Chen told me that her daughter's elementary school had called asking parents to pick up their children early due to what they described as a sudden increase in illness among both students and staff. I made another attempt to reach courthouse security from the main desk. The radio crackled with static, and when I finally got through to someone, the voice on the other end sounded strained, distracted. They told me they were dealing with multiple situations throughout the building and couldn't spare anyone to check on Judge Martinez or escort Rico to the courtroom. That's when I decided to check on Rico myself. Something about his condition that morning had been bothering me, triggering my EMT training in ways I couldn't quite articulate. When I got back down to the holding cells, I found him in a state I'd never seen before in 8 years of dealing with defendants. He was crouched in the corner of his cell, completely motionless except for his eyes, which followed my every movement with laser focus. The scratches on his arms had gotten worse, and there were fresh marks on his neck and face. But what really unsettled me was the complete silence. No more mumbling, no more pacing, just that intense, predatory stare. I approached the cell slowly, using the calm, authoritative voice I'd developed over years of dealing with volatile situations. I asked him how he was feeling, if he needed medical attention, if there was anyone he wanted me to call. He didn't respond with words, but he tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he smiled, and I've seen a lot of disturbing things in my years in law enforcement, but that smile will haunt me forever. It wasn't human. It was the expression of something that had learned to mimic human behavior, but didn't understand what it meant. He pressed his face against the bars and opened his mouth, not to speak, but to bare his teeth like a wild animal preparing to attack. I backed away from the cell, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. Every instinct developed through years of training and experience was screaming that Rico represented a threat unlike anything I'd encountered before. This wasn't just criminal behavior or mental illness. This was something else entirely. By 10:15, I was back upstairs, but my mind kept returning to Rico and the way he'd looked at me. I tried to focus on my duties, but the growing number of no-shows and the increasingly anxious behavior of everyone in the building made it impossible to maintain normal routines. Mrs. Chen approached me around 10:20, looking more worried than I'd ever seen her. She told me that her daughter's school had just called again, this time saying they were closing early and asking all parents to pick up their children immediately. She said the person on the phone had sounded scared, mentioning that several teachers had become violently ill, and that there had been some kind of incident in one of the classrooms that required calling emergency services. I offered to help her leave early, but she insisted on staying until Judge Martinez arrived or we received official word to postpone the remaining cases. Looking back, I admire her dedication, but I wish I'd been more insistent. Mrs. Chen was one of the good ones, someone who genuinely cared about the work we did and the people we served. The few attorneys who had shown up were clustered near the elevators, talking in hushed tones about similar situations at other courthouses throughout the city. One mentioned that his law partner had called from the airport, saying flights were being delayed or canceled due to some kind of medical emergency involving multiple passengers who had become disruptive and had to be restrained. I made another attempt to reach courthouse security, this time walking down to the main security desk on the first floor. The lobby was nearly empty, except for a few people who seemed to be waiting for family members or friends involved in court proceedings. But even they seemed on edge, checking their watches constantly and making frequent phone calls to people who apparently weren't answering. The security desk was unmanned, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning. There was a half-eaten sandwich and a cup of coffee that was still warm, suggesting whoever had been there had left recently and in a hurry. I checked the security monitors and saw several screens showing areas of the building I'd never seen empty during business hours. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere deep in the building, echoing through the corridors in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. But there was something about that sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that evolved to recognize danger. It wasn't the scream of someone who was hurt or scared. It was the sound of something that had given up on being human. I grabbed the radio from the security desk and tried to reach anyone, anywhere in the building. Static. Then fragments of voices, people talking over each other, mentioning incidents and requesting backup that wasn't coming. Someone was shouting about a situation in the family court wing, but the transmission cut out before I could get details. My training kicked in, and I began moving back toward Courtroom 7 to check on Mrs. Chen and the few remaining people in the gallery. But as I reached the stairwell, I heard footsteps below me, moving fast and then more screaming, closer this time. Multiple voices, some shouting for help, others making sounds that didn't seem entirely human. I took the stairs two at a time, my hand on my radio, trying to piece together what was happening from the confused fragments of transmission I was receiving. Someone mentioned the basement level, something about the holding cells, and I immediately thought of Rico and the way he'd looked at me less than an hour earlier. When I reached the third floor, I could hear commotion coming from the direction of Courtroom 7. Not the normal sounds of legal proceedings or even heated arguments between attorneys. This was chaos, people shouting, furniture being overturned, and underneath it all, that same inhuman sound I'd heard echoing from the basement. I approached the courtroom carefully, using skills developed through years of dealing with potentially violent situations. The doors were heavy wood with small windows, and what I saw through those windows made me understand that everything I thought I knew about my job, about maintaining order and protecting people, was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. Mrs. Chen was backed against the court reporter's station, her face pale with terror. The few people who had been in the gallery were pressed against the far wall, and standing between them and the exit were three people I didn't immediately recognize. But their posture, their movements, the way they held their heads reminded me instantly of Rico in his cell that morning. They weren't moving like people anymore. They were moving like predators who had found prey and were deciding how to approach the kill. One of them, a woman in a business suit who might have been an attorney or court clerk, had blood on her hands and face, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She was focused entirely on Mrs. Chen with the same predatory intensity I'd seen in Rico's eyes. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but the only response was static and distant voices too fragmented to understand. Whatever was happening in our building was happening elsewhere too, and help wasn't coming. For the first time in my career, I realized I was completely on my own with a situation I didn't understand and couldn't control using normal procedures. The woman in the business suit suddenly moved toward Mrs. Chen with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had been standing perfectly still just seconds before. Mrs. Chen screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through everything else, and I knew I had to act immediately or watch someone I cared about die in front of me. I pushed through the courtroom doors, using my voice with all the authority I could muster, ordering everyone to stop and move away from each other. The three attackers turned toward me with perfect synchronization, and what I saw in their faces confirmed my worst fears. These weren't people having some kind of breakdown or drug reaction. These were people who had become something else, something that retained human intelligence but had lost everything that made them human. The man closest to me, someone I vaguely recognized as a frequent visitor to family court proceedings, lunged at me with his hands extended like claws. My bailiff training took over, and I managed to sidestep and use his momentum to send him sprawling across the gallery seating. But he recovered impossibly fast, faster than any human should have been able to, and I realized that normal defensive techniques weren't going to be enough. The woman in the business suit was still focused on Mrs. Chen, backing her into a corner where she would have no room to escape. I shouted at her to stop, but she didn't even acknowledge my presence. That's when I understood that whatever these people had become, they were beyond reasoning with, beyond the verbal de-escalation techniques that had been my primary tools for 8 years. I moved toward the woman, intending to physically restrain her before she could harm Mrs. Chen. But as I reached for her arm, she spun around with inhuman speed and slashed at me with fingernails that seemed longer and sharper than they should have been. I felt the sting as her nails raked across my forearm, drawing blood through my shirt. At the time, I thought it was just a minor injury, the kind of scratch you might get breaking up a fight between drunk defendants. I had no idea that those few seconds of contact had sealed my fate, that whatever had turned these people into monsters was now in my bloodstream, beginning a countdown I didn't even know had started. But there wasn't time to worry about a minor scratch. Mrs. Chen was in immediate danger, and there were still other people in the courtroom who needed protection. I managed to grab the woman's wrists and force her away from Mrs. Chen, using techniques I'd learned in corrections training. But her strength was unnatural, and she fought with a ferocity that seemed to increase rather than decrease as our struggle continued. The third attacker, an older man who might have been someone's grandfather attending a custody hearing, was moving toward the terrified people pressed against the wall. I could see in their faces the same expression I'd seen in Mrs. Chen's, the realization that they were facing something beyond their understanding or experience. I made a decision that probably saved several lives, but cost me any chance of escaping what was coming. I released my hold on the woman and threw myself between the older man and his intended victims, taking the full force of his attack. He bit me on the shoulder, his teeth sinking through my uniform shirt and into the muscle beneath. The pain was immediate and intense, but what struck me more was the expression on his face as he bit down. He wasn't angry or afraid or even particularly aggressive. He looked satisfied, almost peaceful, like he was finally doing what he was meant to do. And when he pulled back, his mouth bloody from my shoulder, he smiled the same inhuman smile I'd seen on Rico's face in the holding cell. That's when I knew for certain that whatever was happening wasn't random violence or some kind of mass psychotic break. This was organized, purposeful, and spreading through some kind of transmission that I was only beginning to understand. And based on the way my shoulder was bleeding and the satisfied expressions on the faces of my attackers, I was pretty sure I was now part of whatever was coming next. But I still had a job to do, people to protect, and enough time left to figure out what was really happening before I became like them. I managed to push the older man away and helped Mrs. Chen and the others move toward the courtroom's rear exit, the one that led directly to the stairs I'd used to get back up from the security desk. As we moved, I could hear more screaming from other parts of the building, closer than before, and the sound of running footsteps in the corridors outside. Whatever had started in the basement with Rico was spreading through the courthouse, floor by floor, turning everyone it touched into something that looked human but acted like a predator that had never learned to fear anything. I got Mrs. Chen and 3 other survivors to the stairwell, but I could already hear sounds coming from both above and below us. We were trapped between floors, in a building that was becoming more dangerous with every passing minute, with no communication to the outside world and no idea how far this outbreak had spread beyond our walls. That's when I made the decision that probably kept me alive long enough to record this message for you. Instead of trying to escape the building, which would have meant fighting our way through unknown numbers of infected people, I decided to go up, to find a defensible position where we could wait for help, or at least figure out what we were really dealing with. The fourth-floor security office had always been my backup plan for serious emergencies, a place with thick walls, limited access points, and its own communication equipment. If we could reach it and barricade ourselves inside, we might have enough time to understand what was happening and develop a strategy for survival. But as we started climbing the stairs, with the sounds of chaos growing louder below us and the smell of smoke beginning to drift up from the lower floors, I realized that the next few hours were going to test everything I'd learned in 8 years of keeping order in one of the most dangerous buildings in Los Angeles. And based on the way my shoulder was throbbing and the strange taste that was starting to develop in my mouth, I wasn't sure how much time I had left to figure out how to keep these people alive. What I heard next changed everything I thought I knew about survival, about human nature, and about what happens when the systems we depend on completely break down. But that's a story that's going to take the rest of this recording to tell. Because what happened over the next few hours taught me lessons that might be the only thing standing between you and becoming one of them. The moment we reached the second-floor landing, I knew we weren't dealing with an isolated incident in Courtroom 7. The sounds coming from below us had multiplied, echoing through the stairwell like some kind of sick symphony. Multiple voices screaming, not for help, but in that same inhuman way I'd heard from the people who attacked us. And underneath it all, the sound of doors slamming, glass breaking, and what I can only describe as hunting calls. I pressed my back against the stairwell door and motioned for Mrs. Chen and the others to stay quiet while I tried to get a sense of what was happening on this floor. Through the small window in the door, I could see the hallway that led to the family court offices. The fluorescent lights were flickering, and there were papers scattered across the floor like someone had swept everything off the desks in a panic. But what caught my attention was the blood on the walls. Not splattered like you might see in a violent crime scene, but smeared in long streaks, like someone had been dragged along the corridor while bleeding heavily. And at the end of those streaks, I could see an office door that had been torn completely off its hinges. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin through my shirt. When I looked at her, she was pointing back down the stairwell. Below us, maybe one floor down, I could hear footsteps on the concrete stairs. Not the normal sound of someone walking, but a rhythmic pounding, like someone was running up the stairs 2 or 3 steps at a time with more energy than any human should have had. I made the decision to keep moving upward. Whatever was coming up those stairs was moving faster than we could, and our only chance was to reach the 4th-floor security office before they reached us. I grabbed Mrs. Chen's hand and whispered to the others to follow me as quietly as possible. As we climbed past the 3rd floor, I caught a glimpse through the stairwell window of something that made my blood run cold. The main corridor was filled with people, but they weren't running or panicking like you'd expect during an emergency. They were standing perfectly still, all facing the same direction, all with that same predatory posture I'd seen in the courtroom attackers. And they were all looking at the stairwell door. It was like they could sense our presence through the walls, like they were waiting for us to try to exit on that floor. The silence from that crowd was more terrifying than all the screaming I'd heard before, because it suggested a level of coordination and intelligence that I hadn't expected from people who seemed to have lost their minds. One of the survivors with us, an elderly man named Mr. Rodriguez who had been waiting for a guardianship hearing, whispered that he could see more of them gathering near the elevators. He said they were moving with purpose, like they were setting up some kind of trap or ambush. That's when I realized that whatever these people had become, they weren't just mindlessly violent. They were organized, strategic, and they were learning. We reached the 4th floor without encountering anyone directly, but I could hear sounds coming from multiple locations throughout the building now. Doors slamming, glass breaking, and that rhythmic pounding of footsteps that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The building's fire alarm should have been going off. The emergency lighting should have activated, but none of the automated safety systems were working. The security office was at the end of a long corridor lined with administrative offices and storage rooms. As we moved toward it, I noticed that most of the office doors were standing open, and the rooms beyond looked like they'd been searched or ransacked. But there was something methodical about the destruction, like someone had been looking for specific things rather than just destroying everything they could find. I used my security keycard to open the door to the main security office, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like we might have found somewhere defensible. The office had thick walls, reinforced doors, and its own ventilation system. More importantly, it had banks of security monitors that could show us what was happening throughout the building. Mrs. Chen and the other survivors huddled near the back wall while I activated the security system. What I saw on those monitors confirmed my worst fears and taught me things about this outbreak that probably saved my life over the next few days. The infected weren't randomly wandering through the building. They were systematically searching every room, every floor, working their way through the courthouse with the kind of thoroughness you'd expect from trained law enforcement conducting a building sweep. On the first floor monitors, I could see them checking every office in the clerk's section, opening every door, looking under every desk. On the second floor, they had formed what looked like search teams, with some of them acting as lookouts while others investigated specific areas. And on the third floor, they were gathered near the stairwell, clearly aware that we had passed through and trying to determine which direction we had gone. But what really chilled me was watching them communicate with each other. They weren't speaking, at least not in any language I could recognize, but they were definitely exchanging information. Hand gestures, head tilts, changes in posture that seemed to convey specific meanings. They had retained enough human intelligence to coordinate their actions, but they were using it for purposes that were anything but human. I tried the radio system, cycling through every emergency frequency I could access. Most channels were completely silent, but on a few I caught fragments of transmissions that painted a picture of citywide chaos. Scattered reports from police units about multiple incidents involving what they described as extremely violent individuals who seemed immune to normal restraint techniques. Hospital emergency rooms being overrun with patients displaying similar symptoms to what I'd seen in Rico and the courtroom attackers. One transmission that I'll never forget came from what sounded like a National Guard unit requesting immediate backup for what they described as a mass casualty event at a water treatment facility. The transmission cut off abruptly, but not before I heard someone in the background shouting about the need to shut down all water distribution to affected areas immediately. That's when the pieces started coming together for me. The water fountain I'd used Monday morning. The reports of contamination I'd heard on the morning news. Rico's rapid deterioration after being in the courthouse overnight, probably drinking the same contaminated water. This wasn't some random outbreak or terrorist attack. This was something that had gotten into the water supply, and anyone who had consumed it was on a timer toward becoming one of those things I'd seen on the monitors. I looked at Mrs. Chen and realized she was probably safe. She always brought her own bottled water to work, something about not trusting the building's plumbing. But Mr. Rodriguez and the other survivors had all mentioned being thirsty earlier in the day, and I'd seen at least one of them use the water fountain near the courtroom. The scratch on my arm and the bite on my shoulder suddenly seemed like minor concerns, compared to the possibility that I'd been infected through water consumption more than 24 hours earlier. My EMT training helped me recognize the early symptoms I'd been ignoring. The metallic taste in my mouth that I'd attributed to stress. The slight tremor in my hands that I'd blamed on adrenaline. The way sounds seemed sharper, more distinct than they should have been. And most disturbing of all, the way I was starting to feel less concerned about our immediate danger and more focused on the tactical aspects of our situation. But I couldn't let the others know what I suspected about my condition. They needed someone who could think clearly and make rational decisions, and panicking them about the possibility that their protector was infected wouldn't help anyone survive the next few hours. I had to assume I had some time left, maybe 12 to 24 hours based on the timeline I'd observed in Rico, and use that time to get them to safety. The security monitors showed the infected had reached our floor and were beginning their systematic search of the administrative wing. They moved through each office with the same methodical approach I'd seen on the lower floors, but there was something different about their behavior up here. They seemed more focused, more purposeful, like they knew we were somewhere on this floor and were determined to find us. I started looking for alternative escape routes, studying the building schematics that were mounted on the office wall. The courthouse had been designed with multiple emergency exits and secure areas, but most of those were on lower floors that were now completely overrun. However, there was a maintenance stairway that connected to the roof, and from there, we might be able to reach the adjacent building or at least signal for help. Mrs. Chen had been watching the monitors with me, and she pointed to one screen that showed the main lobby. Emergency vehicles were pulling up outside, ambulances and police cars with their lights flashing, but the personnel weren't entering the building. Instead, they seemed to be setting up some kind of perimeter, keeping people from getting close to the courthouse entrances. That told me that whatever was happening inside our building was now known to emergency services. But they either didn't understand the full scope of the threat or didn't have the resources to mount a rescue operation. We were effectively on our own until someone higher up the chain of command could organize a response appropriate to the situation. I tried to reach emergency services using the office phone system, but the call wouldn't go through. Not because the phones were dead, but because I kept getting busy signals or recordings saying that all circuits were occupied. That suggested the problem was much bigger than just our courthouse, that emergency services throughout the city were overwhelmed with similar incidents. The infected on our floor were getting closer, and I could hear them in the corridor outside the security office. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore, and the sounds they were making had changed. Instead of the hunting calls I'd heard earlier, they were making what sounded almost like conversation, but in tones and rhythms that didn't match any human language I'd ever encountered. Mr. Rodriguez whispered that he could smell smoke, and when I checked the monitors for the lower floors, I could see that fires had started in several locations. Whether this was accidental damage from the infected's rampage or something more deliberate, I couldn't tell, but it meant we had a time limit on how long we could stay in the building. The ventilation system was starting to carry the smell of smoke to our floor, along with something else that made my skin crawl. It was a scent I'd encountered during my EMT training, the distinctive smell of human blood, but concentrated in a way that suggested massive casualties somewhere in the building below us. One of the other survivors, a young woman who had been waiting for a restraining order hearing, started hyperventilating when she realized what that smell meant. I had to use techniques I'd learned for calming panicked defendants to keep her from making enough noise to give away our location. But her reaction was completely understandable. The scope of what was happening was beyond anything any of us had been prepared for. I made the decision to prepare for evacuation to the roof, but first I wanted to gather as much intelligence as possible about the situation outside the building. The security office had external cameras that showed the surrounding streets, and what I saw there made me understand that our courthouse wasn't an isolated incident. There were similar scenes playing out at buildings throughout downtown. Emergency vehicles everywhere, people running in panic, and in some areas what looked like military vehicles setting up roadblocks. Smoke was rising from multiple locations across the city, and I could see helicopters circling areas that seemed to be experiencing the same kind of chaos we were dealing with. But most disturbing was the behavior of people on the streets. Even from our height, I could see individuals and small groups moving with the same predatory coordination I'd observed in the infected inside our building. This wasn't contained to people who had consumed contaminated water from our specific source. This was citywide, possibly regional, and it was spreading faster than any emergency response could contain. The infected outside our office were now trying the door handle, testing the strength of our barricades. I could hear them pressing against the door, not frantically like humans trying to escape danger, but with the patient persistence of predators who knew their prey was trapped and had nowhere to go. That's when I noticed something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. On the security monitor that showed the corridor outside our office, I could see them working together to examine our defenses. One of them was running their hands along the door frame, feeling for weaknesses, while another was studying the lock mechanism. They weren't just trying to break down the door through brute force. They were problem-solving, using retained human intelligence to figure out the most efficient way to reach us. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm and pointed to another monitor. More infected were arriving on our floor, coming up through both stairwells, and they seemed to be responding to some kind of signal from the ones already outside our door. Within minutes, we went from having 3 or 4 of them trying to get into the office to having more than a dozen gathered in the corridor. I realized we had maybe 10 or 15 minutes before they either found a way through our defenses or decided to try more aggressive methods. The roof access was our only remaining option, but it meant moving through corridors that were now patrolled by infected who were actively hunting for us. I gathered the survivors and explained the situation as calmly as I could. We needed to move to the maintenance stairway, reach the roof, and hope that emergency services could extract us from there. But the route would take us through areas where we might encounter infected, and everyone needed to understand that our survival depended on staying quiet, staying together, and following my lead without question. Mr. Rodriguez asked about the smoke that was getting thicker, and I had to tell him honestly that the building was becoming uninhabitable regardless of the infected. We could stay and hope our barricades held until help arrived, or we could try to reach a location where rescue was actually possible. Neither option was safe, but at least moving gave us some control over our fate. The young woman who had been hyperventilating earlier asked me directly if I thought we were all going to die. I looked at her, at Mrs. Chen, at the other frightened faces around me, and I realized that lying to them wouldn't help anyone. I told them that I'd seen enough in my years as a bailiff and EMT to know that survival often comes down to making hard decisions and refusing to give up even when the situation seems hopeless. What I didn't tell them was that based on my growing understanding of the infection timeline, I probably wouldn't be myself much longer. The metallic taste was getting stronger. My vision was becoming sharper in ways that didn't feel entirely human. And I was starting to have thoughts about the people around me that scared me more than anything I'd seen on the security monitors. But I still had enough time to get them to safety, and that was going to have to be enough. Because outside that door, I could hear the infected working with increased urgency, and the sound of tools being used against our barricades. They had found implements somewhere in the building, probably from the maintenance areas, and they were approaching our defenses with the methodical efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish. The next few hours were going to determine whether any of us lived to see another day, and whether the lessons I was learning about survival in an impossible situation would ever reach anyone who could use them. But first, we had to make it through the longest night any of us had ever experienced, in a building that was becoming more dangerous with every minute that passed. The scraping sound against our barricaded door was getting more systematic, more purposeful. Through the security monitors, I could see that the infected had somehow acquired tools from the maintenance areas. One of them was using what looked like a crowbar to work at the door frame, while others positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the corridor. They weren't just trying to break in anymore. They were preparing for our eventual exit, setting up what could only be described as an ambush. I made the decision to move toward the maintenance stairway while we still had the element of surprise. The route would take us through 2 corridors, and past 3 offices that could potentially contain infected. But staying in the security office was no longer an option. The smoke was getting thicker, and I could hear the sound of structural damage from the floors below us. Mrs. Chen helped me gather emergency supplies from the office cabinets. Flashlights, first aid materials, and most importantly, several bottles of water that had been stored in a sealed cabinet since before the contamination occurred. I made sure everyone understood that under no circumstances should they consume any water from building sources, even if they were dying of thirst. The young woman from the restraining order hearing, who had told me her name was Sarah, asked why the infected seemed so focused on finding us specifically. It was a good question, one that had been bothering me as well. On the monitors, I could see that they had passed by other potential hiding spots, without giving them the same level of attention they were directing toward our location. I explained my theory that the infection somehow enhanced their ability to track living humans, possibly through scent or body heat or some other sensory ability we didn't understand. But what concerned me more was the possibility that they retained enough memory and intelligence to recognize that a security office would be a logical place for survivors to gather. Mr. Rodriguez pointed out something I had missed on the monitors. The infected weren't just on our floor anymore. They were positioning themselves at key points throughout the building, near stairwells and exits, like they were anticipating our movements. This suggested a level of coordination that went beyond simple pack hunting behavior. I studied the building schematics more carefully, looking for routes that would avoid the areas where I'd seen infected gathering. The maintenance stairway was still our best option, but we would need to create a distraction to draw their attention away from our actual escape route. Using the office phone system, I was able to activate the fire alarm on the second floor, hoping the sound would draw infected away from our area. The response was immediate and disturbing. Instead of rushing toward the alarm like humans would during an emergency, the infected seemed to understand that it was a diversion. Some moved toward the sound, but others remained in position, as if they knew it was a trick. That level of strategic thinking was terrifying, because it meant we couldn't rely on conventional tactics to outmaneuver them. They were learning, adapting, and they understood human psychology well enough to anticipate our actions. Every escape plan would need to account for the possibility that they were several steps ahead of us. The structural damage I'd been hearing was getting worse, and through the monitors I could see that fires had spread to multiple floors. The building's sprinkler system should have activated automatically, but nothing was working properly. Whether this was due to infected interference or system failures caused by the chaos, I couldn't determine. I made the decision to disable the security office systems before we left, ensuring that if any infected reached this location, they wouldn't be able to use the monitors to track other survivors who might still be in the building. It felt like abandoning a strategic advantage, but leaving that capability in their hands would be worse. Sarah asked me directly if I thought we were the only survivors left in the courthouse. I had to admit that based on what I'd seen on the monitors and heard over the radio, it was likely that most people in the building had either escaped early in the outbreak or had been infected. We might be among the last uninfected people still inside. But that also meant that any rescue operation would be focused on preventing the infected from leaving the building, rather than extracting survivors from inside. Emergency services would be treating this as a containment situation, not a rescue mission. We needed to reach the roof and signal for help before they made the decision to seal the building completely. The sound of tools against our door was becoming more urgent, and I could see cracks forming in the wooden frame. We had maybe 5 more minutes before our defenses failed completely. I gathered everyone near the office's rear exit, which led directly to the corridor we needed to traverse to reach the maintenance stairway. Before we left, I tried one more time to establish radio contact with emergency services. This time I managed to reach what sounded like a police dispatcher, but the conversation was brief and discouraging. They confirmed that the courthouse was under quarantine and that no rescue operations were planned for the immediate future. Anyone inside was considered potentially infected and would not be evacuated until the situation was stabilized. That conversation made it clear that reaching the roof was our only chance of survival. Emergency services weren't going to come looking for us, and they certainly weren't going to risk their personnel by entering a building that they believed was completely overrun. We had to save ourselves, and we had to do it before the building became completely uninhabitable. I opened the rear exit carefully, checking the corridor through the small window before exposing any of us to potential attack. The hallway was empty, but I could hear movement from the offices on either side. The infected were definitely present on this floor, but they seemed to be focused on the main corridor where they expected us to emerge from the security office. We moved in single file, with me leading and Mrs. Chen bringing up the rear to ensure no one fell behind. The maintenance stairway was only 50 yards away, but those 50 yards felt like the longest distance I'd ever traveled. Every step had to be silent, every movement calculated to avoid drawing attention from the infected who were hunting for us. Halfway to our destination, we heard the sound of our security office door finally giving way. The noise of splintering wood and the immediate response from infected throughout the floor told me that our hiding place had been completely compromised. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to the relative safety of that barricaded room. The infected's reaction to breaching our defenses was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of rushing into the empty office, they seemed to pause, assess the situation, and then immediately begin searching for alternative routes we might have taken. Through the walls, I could hear them moving with purpose toward the rear exit we had just used. I realized they could track us more effectively than I'd hoped. Whether through scent, residual heat signatures, or some other enhanced sensory ability, they knew exactly which direction we had gone. The maintenance stairway was still our best option, but we would need to move much faster than I'd originally planned. We reached the stairway access door just as I heard the infected entering the corridor behind us. The door was locked, requiring a maintenance key that I didn't have, but the lock was old and the door frame was showing signs of wear. I used the emergency crowbar from the security office to force the lock, knowing that the noise would immediately reveal our location. The stairway beyond was narrow and poorly lit, clearly designed for maintenance personnel rather than emergency evacuation. But it led directly to roof access, and more importantly, it was a route that the infected probably weren't familiar with. We might gain precious minutes while they figured out where we had gone. As we started climbing, I could hear them reaching the stairway door behind us. The sound of multiple bodies pressing against the metal barrier was followed by the systematic approach I'd come to expect from them. They were testing the door, examining the forced lock, determining the most efficient way to follow us. Sarah was struggling with the climb, her breathing becoming labored from stress and exertion. Mr. Rodriguez, despite his age, was handling the physical demands better than any of us had expected. Mrs. Chen stayed close to Sarah, offering encouragement and support while maintaining the pace I'd set for our ascent. 3 flights up, we reached a landing where the stairway split into 2 directions. One path continued toward the roof, while the other led to the building's upper mechanical systems. I made the decision to continue toward the roof, but I also opened the door to the mechanical area and left it open, hoping to create confusion about which route we had actually taken. The infected had successfully breached the stairway door and were now climbing behind us, but their progress seemed slower than their movement through the building's main corridors. The narrow stairway forced them into single file, reducing their ability to coordinate and surround us as they had in more open areas. But what concerned me was the sound of additional infected entering the stairway from above. Somehow, they had anticipated our destination and positioned themselves to cut off our escape route. We were being forced into a tactical situation with hostile forces both above and below us, and our options were becoming increasingly limited. I stopped our group at the next landing and tried to assess our situation. The mechanical area might offer alternative routes or hiding places, but it would also trap us away from our primary objective of reaching the roof. Continuing upward meant facing unknown numbers of infected who were waiting for us, but it was still our only path to potential rescue. Mrs. Chen made a suggestion that surprised me with its tactical sophistication. She proposed that we split into two groups, with one creating a distraction in the mechanical area while the other continued toward the roof. It was risky, but it might be our only chance of getting anyone to safety. I rejected the idea immediately, not because it was tactically unsound, but because my responsibility was to keep everyone together and safe. Splitting up would improve the odds for some of us while virtually guaranteeing that others wouldn't survive. As a bailiff, I'd sworn to protect people, and I wasn't going to abandon that oath even in circumstances this extreme. The sound of infected above us was getting closer, and I realized we needed to make a decision immediately. We could try to fight our way through to the roof. We could retreat to the mechanical area and look for alternative escape routes, or we could attempt to go back down and find another way up. I chose to continue toward the roof, but with modifications to our approach. Instead of moving as a group, we would advance in stages, with each person covering the next while maintaining communication through hand signals. It was a technique I'd learned during tactical training, adapted for our specific situation. Sarah asked me quietly if I really thought we could fight our way past the infected who were waiting above us. I had to be honest with her about our chances, which weren't good, but I also explained that sometimes survival comes down to making the best of impossible choices rather than finding perfect solutions. The truth was that my condition was continuing to deteriorate in ways that were both helpful and terrifying. My vision was becoming sharper, my hearing more acute, and my reflexes faster than they'd ever been. But along with those improvements came changes in my thinking patterns that made me question whether I was still entirely human. I was starting to understand the infected's behavior on an instinctive level, anticipating their movements and strategies in ways that should have been impossible. Part of me recognized this as a valuable tactical advantage, but another part was horrified by how natural it felt to think like them. We reached the final landing before the roof access, and I could see light coming from under the door above us. But I could also hear movement on the other side, the same purposeful, coordinated activity I'd observed throughout the building. They were waiting for us, and they had chosen their position carefully. Mr. Rodriguez pointed out that the smoke from the building fires was getting much thicker at this level, and that the roof might not be the safe haven we were hoping for. If the building was structurally compromised by fire damage, roof access might put us in immediate danger of collapse or smoke inhalation. But we had come too far and exhausted too many alternatives to turn back now. The roof was still our best chance of signaling for help and potentially being rescued by emergency services. Whatever was waiting for us on the other side of that door, we would have to deal with it and hope that our human intelligence and determination could overcome their enhanced physical capabilities. I prepared to open the roof access door, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether any of us lived to see another day. The infected below us were getting closer. The ones above us were preparing for our arrival, and the building around us was becoming increasingly unstable. What happened when I opened that door taught me lessons about survival that I never could have learned from any training manual, and showed me capabilities I didn't know I possessed. But it also confirmed my worst fears about what I was becoming, and started a countdown that I knew would end with me joining the ranks of the creatures we were trying so desperately to escape. When I opened the roof access door, the first thing that hit me was the scope of what was happening beyond our building. The courthouse wasn't an isolated incident. From our position 4 stories above street level, I could see smoke rising from dozens of locations throughout downtown Los Angeles. Emergency vehicle lights created a constellation of red and blue across the urban landscape, and the sound of sirens was constant, overlapping, creating a wall of noise that spoke to citywide chaos. But what made my blood run cold was seeing the infected on neighboring rooftops. They weren't random individuals who had climbed up to escape the chaos below. They were positioned strategically, watching the streets, observing the emergency response patterns. Some were even using what looked like makeshift signals to communicate with infected in other buildings. The roof of our courthouse was empty when we emerged, but I could see evidence that infected had been there recently. Scattered debris arranged in patterns that seemed too organized to be accidental, and scratch marks on the roof access housing that looked like territorial markings. They had been using this space for purposes I was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Chen immediately moved toward the edge of the building to look for emergency personnel who might be able to help us. But what she saw made her step back with an expression of pure terror. The courthouse was surrounded by a perimeter of police vehicles and National Guard units, but they weren't positioned for rescue operations. They were aimed inward, treating the building like a containment zone that nothing should be allowed to escape from. Sarah asked me why the authorities weren't trying to help survivors, and I had to explain what I was learning about quarantine protocols. From their perspective, anyone still inside the building after several hours of outbreak conditions was potentially infected and represented a threat to public safety. Our survival had become less important than preventing the spread of whatever was causing this transformation. The radio chatter I could pick up from emergency frequencies confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the outbreak. Similar incidents were being reported from water treatment facilities, schools, hospitals, and government buildings throughout the metropolitan area. This wasn't contained to people who had consumed contaminated water from our specific source. The contamination was widespread, systematic, and it was overwhelming every emergency response capability in the region. Mr. Rodriguez pointed out that several helicopters were circling the area, but they were maintaining distance from the buildings and seemed to be conducting surveillance rather than rescue operations. When I tried to signal one of them using the emergency flare from the roof maintenance kit, the helicopter actually moved further away, as if our presence on the roof was seen as a threat rather than a call for help. That's when I understood that we weren't going to be rescued from the roof. Emergency services had written off everyone inside the quarantine zone, and our appearance on the roof only confirmed to them that the building was still occupied by potentially dangerous individuals. We were on our own, and we needed to find another way to reach safety. The infected from the stairway had reached the roof access door, but they weren't trying to break through immediately. Through the door, I could hear them moving around on the landing below, making sounds that suggested they were organizing themselves for a coordinated assault. They had learned from observing our escape patterns, and they weren't going to make the same mistakes twice. I started looking for alternative escape routes from the roof. The adjacent buildings were close enough that we might be able to jump the gap under normal circumstances, but with smoke reducing visibility and infected potentially waiting on those rooftops as well, it would be an extremely dangerous gamble. However, staying on our current roof was becoming impossible as the building fires spread upward and the infected prepared to overrun our position. Sarah noticed that the infected we could see on nearby buildings weren't moving randomly anymore. They were all facing toward our location, perfectly still, like they were waiting for some kind of signal. The coordination was becoming more sophisticated with each passing hour, suggesting that whatever process was transforming these people was also creating some kind of collective intelligence. Mrs. Chen made an observation that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. She pointed out that the infected on the other buildings were positioning themselves to block potential escape routes we might try to use. They weren't just reacting to our presence. They were anticipating our actions and preparing countermeasures. That level of strategic planning meant that every move we made was being observed, analyzed, and prepared for by an intelligence that understood human behavior, but was no longer constrained by human limitations. We were being hunted by something that retained our problem-solving abilities while gaining enhanced physical capabilities and losing our moral constraints. The radio traffic I was monitoring included increasing references to something called Zone Alpha, which seemed to be a fallback position for emergency services when containment protocols failed. From the context of the transmissions, it sounded like they were preparing to abandon the entire downtown area and establish a defensive perimeter further out. I realized that the scratches on my arm and the bite on my shoulder weren't just minor injuries anymore. The wounds were healing with unnatural speed, but the tissue around them was changing color and texture. More concerning was the way my thought processes were shifting, becoming more tactical, more focused on survival and territory than on protecting the people I was supposed to be helping. The metallic taste in my mouth was getting stronger, and I was starting to have difficulty distinguishing between my own thoughts and impulses that seemed to come from somewhere else. My enhanced senses were allowing me to track the movements of infected throughout the area, but that same enhancement was making me increasingly aware of the living humans around me in ways that felt predatory. Mr. Rodriguez asked me directly if I was feeling all right, and I realized that my behavior was becoming noticeable to the others. I was standing differently, moving with a fluid efficiency that hadn't been there before, and making tactical observations that required knowledge I shouldn't have possessed. The infection was progressing faster than I'd hoped, and I was running out of time to get these people to safety. I made the decision to attempt crossing to the adjacent building, while I still retained enough human judgment to prioritize their survival over my own changing instincts. The gap was about 8 feet, manageable for someone in good physical condition, but it would require precise timing and coordination to get everyone across safely. But as we prepared for the jump, the infected below us finally made their move. The roof access door exploded outward, and they poured onto the roof with a speed and coordination that was beyond anything I'd seen from them before. They had been planning this assault, waiting for the optimal moment, and they executed it with military precision. The first wave consisted of 3 infected who immediately spread out to cut off our access to different sections of the roof. Behind them came others who positioned themselves to prevent us from retreating back into the building. Within seconds, we were surrounded by individuals who moved like trained soldiers, but looked at us with the hungry focus of predators. What struck me most was their silence. Unlike the earlier encounters where they had made various sounds, these infected communicated through gestures and body language alone. They had developed their own tactical communication system, and they were using it to coordinate an attack designed to capture rather than kill us immediately. Sarah screamed when she realized we were trapped, but the sound seemed to trigger something in the infected around us. They all turned toward her with perfect synchronization, tilting their heads at the same angle, studying her with an intensity that suggested they were analyzing her psychological state and determining the best approach to take her down. I stepped between Sarah and the nearest infected, drawing on my bailiff training to project authority and control in an impossible situation. But as I faced the infected leader, I realized that I was starting to understand their body language on an instinctive level. The way they held their shoulders, the angle of their heads, the positioning of their hands, it all conveyed information that I could somehow interpret. That understanding terrified me because it meant I was further along in the infection process than I'd admitted to myself. The virus, or whatever was causing this transformation, wasn't just changing people physically. It was integrating them into a collective intelligence that operated according to rules I was beginning to comprehend from the inside. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm and whispered that she could see more infected climbing up the exterior walls of the building. They weren't just coming from the stairway anymore. They were approaching from multiple directions, using abilities that normal humans shouldn't have possessed. The infection was enhancing their physical capabilities in ways that made them far more dangerous than I'd originally understood. The infected surrounding us weren't attacking yet, but their positioning made it clear that escape was impossible. They were waiting for something, possibly the arrival of more of their kind, or perhaps for us to make a move that would trigger their response. The patience they displayed was more unsettling than outright aggression would have been. I tried to establish radio contact with emergency services one more time, hoping to provide intelligence about the infected's capabilities and coordination. But the response I received made it clear that the situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of external rescue. Emergency services were falling back to secondary positions, and the entire downtown area was being declared a loss. The conversation I overheard between National Guard units included references to aerial reconnaissance showing infected moving in coordinated groups throughout the quarantine zone. They weren't random individuals driven mad by infection. They were becoming something that retained human intelligence while gaining new capabilities and motivations. Mr. Rodriguez asked me what we should do, and I realized that the traditional leadership role I'd been playing was no longer appropriate. The people around me needed someone who could think like the infected while still caring about human survival. Unfortunately, I was becoming exactly that kind of person, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could maintain the balance. The infected leader stepped closer to me, and I found myself responding with body language that mirrored theirs. Not consciously, but instinctively, like I was participating in a conversation I didn't fully understand. The other survivors noticed the change in my posture, and I could see fear in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Sarah asked me directly if I was infected, and I knew I couldn't lie to them anymore. The transformation was accelerating, and they deserved to know what they were dealing with. But I also knew that telling them would probably cause panic that would get them killed, either by triggering an attack from the infected around us, or by causing them to make desperate decisions that would lead to their capture. The building beneath us was becoming structurally unsound as the fires spread and the emergency suppression systems failed. Smoke was pouring through the roof access, and I could hear the sounds of floors collapsing somewhere below us. We had minutes before the roof became uninhabitable, regardless of the infected threat. I made a decision that probably saved their lives but sealed my own fate. I told the others to prepare to run toward the building edge when I created a distraction, and to jump to the adjacent roof without hesitation. I would stay behind to buy them time, using my growing understanding of infected behavior to confuse and delay the group surrounding us. Mrs. Chen protested that we should stay together, but I explained that my condition made me more of a liability than an asset. The infected were reacting to me differently than they were to the others, possibly because they could sense the changes happening in my system. My presence was actually drawing their attention and making it harder for the pure humans to escape. What I didn't tell them was that I was starting to feel the pull of the collective intelligence myself. Part of me wanted to join the group surrounding us, to become part of something larger and more powerful than individual human consciousness. Fighting that impulse was becoming more difficult with each passing minute. The infected leader made a gesture that I somehow understood as an invitation to surrender voluntarily. The offer was tempting on a level that scared me more than anything I'd experienced since this nightmare began. But I still had enough human will left to reject it and focus on getting the others to safety. I created the distraction by throwing the emergency flare directly at the infected leader, causing temporary confusion and disorientation among the group. In that moment of chaos, Mrs. Chen, Sarah, and Mr. Rodriguez ran toward the building edge and made the jump to the adjacent roof. I watched them land safely and start moving away from the quarantine zone. The infected around me recovered quickly from the distraction, but their behavior toward me had changed. Instead of treating me as prey to be captured, they were now responding to me as something closer to an equal. The transformation was nearly complete, and they could sense it. As the roof began to collapse beneath us and smoke filled the air around us, I realized that this would be my last opportunity to record what I'd learned about the outbreak and the infected's capabilities. The information might be crucial for other survivors, and it was the last human contribution I could make before losing myself completely to whatever I was becoming. The moment Mrs. Chen, Sarah, and Mr. Rodriguez disappeared over the edge of the adjacent building, I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as a final severing of human connection. The infected around me sensed it immediately, their posture changing from predatory alertness to something that resembled recognition, even acceptance. I was crossing a threshold that I'd been fighting against for the past 3 days, and there was no turning back. I managed to make it back into the building through the collapsing roof access, using enhanced reflexes and strength that definitely weren't human anymore. The stairway that had been so difficult to climb earlier now felt like nothing, and I could move through the smoke-filled corridors with vision that had adapted to see clearly in conditions that would have blinded me just hours before. But I wasn't moving randomly through the building. I was following impulses that led me to specific locations, guided by knowledge I shouldn't have possessed about where resources and strategic positions could be found. The collective intelligence that I'd observed in the other infected was becoming part of my own consciousness, providing information and directing my actions in ways that felt both foreign and completely natural. I found myself in the security office where this whole nightmare had started, but now I was seeing it through different eyes. The barricades we'd built seemed crude and ineffective, the hiding spots obvious and poorly chosen. The infected had always known exactly where we were, and they'd been patient because they understood that humans in panic make predictable decisions. The recording equipment was still functional despite the building damage, and I realized this might be my last opportunity to document what I'd learned while I still retained enough human awareness to care about warning others. The transformation was accelerating, but there were still fragments of Joaquin Herrera left inside whatever I was becoming. What I need you to understand is that the infected aren't mindless monsters like in the movies. They retain human intelligence, human memory, human problem-solving abilities. But those capabilities are now directed by motivations and priorities that have nothing to do with human survival or human morality. They're becoming something new, something that sees uninfected humans the way we might see animals that need to be managed or resources that need to be harvested. The water contamination wasn't accidental. Through the collective consciousness I was accessing, I could sense that this had been planned, coordinated, implemented with a precision that required understanding of human infrastructure and human psychology. Someone or something had decided that humanity as we knew it needed to be upgraded, and they'd found a way to do it through our most basic necessity. The timeline I'd observed in myself and others wasn't random either. The 48-hour incubation period allows the infected to blend with human populations long enough to spread the contamination widely before their transformation becomes obvious. By the time symptoms appear, entire communities can be compromised without anyone realizing what's happening. Mrs. Chen and the others had reached the adjacent building safely, but I could track their movement through the collective awareness that was becoming stronger every minute. The infected throughout the city weren't just randomly distributed. They were positioned to funnel survivors toward specific locations, creating predictable patterns that could be exploited for whatever purposes the collective intelligence had in mind. The government response I'd monitored wasn't adequate because it was based on assumptions about human behavior and human limitations. Emergency services were treating this like a containment problem, but the infected were already beyond the quarantine zones, integrated into the general population, waiting for signals that would trigger the next phase of whatever transformation was occurring. I tried to reach emergency frequencies one more time, but the communications I intercepted told me that the situation had deteriorated far beyond what anyone in authority was willing to admit publicly. Zone Alpha had been abandoned, Zone Beta was under assault, and references to Zone Gamma suggested they were falling back to positions outside the metropolitan area entirely. The National Guard units I'd seen surrounding our building were no longer there. Through windows, I could see that the perimeter had been pulled back several blocks, and even those positions looked temporary, like they were preparing for further retreat. The infected had either overrun the immediate containment zone or demonstrated capabilities that made close proximity too dangerous for conventional forces. My enhanced senses were picking up infected throughout the building, but they weren't searching or hunting anymore. They were settling into positions, organizing the space, preparing for some kind of long-term occupation. The courthouse was becoming a base of operations, and I was beginning to understand my role in whatever was coming next. The collective intelligence provided information about similar transformations occurring in other cities, other countries. This wasn't limited to Los Angeles or even the United States. The contamination had been introduced simultaneously into water system across multiple continents, suggesting coordination on a scale that required resources and planning far beyond what any human organization could have accomplished. But the most disturbing realization was that the infected weren't trying to kill all humans. They were selecting specific individuals for transformation, while allowing others to survive in controlled environments. Mrs. Chen, Sarah, and Mr. Rodriguez hadn't escaped because of their skill or luck. They'd been allowed to leave because they served some purpose in the larger plan. I could sense other survivors throughout the city, most of them unaware that their movements were being monitored and guided by infected who were learning to mimic human behavior so perfectly that detection was nearly impossible. The transformation process wasn't just creating physically enhanced predators. It was creating infiltrators who could pass for human while serving the collective intelligence's objectives. My own transformation was providing insights into capabilities that emergency services couldn't possibly prepare for. Enhanced strength, speed, and reflexes were just the beginning. The infected could see in conditions that would blind humans, hear sounds across frequency ranges that human ears couldn't detect, and coordinate their actions through communication methods that didn't rely on technology that could be monitored or jammed. But perhaps most dangerous was their patience and their long-term planning ability. The infected weren't driven by hunger or aggression, or any of the motivations that movies and books had taught people to expect. They were working toward goals that might take months or years to accomplish, and they were willing to sacrifice individual infected to advance those objectives. The building around me was stabilizing as the infected took control of fire suppression and structural repair. They were preserving the courthouse not as a shelter, but as a command center, using the same systematic approach they'd shown in hunting survivors to organize resources and communications. They understood human infrastructure well enough to maintain and operate it for their own purposes. Through the collective consciousness, I could access information about infection vectors, transformation timelines, and behavioral modifications that was far more detailed than anything I'd been able to observe as a human. The water contamination was just the initial delivery method. The infection was also transmissible through blood contact, respiratory droplets, and even extended proximity to individuals in advanced stages of transformation. The scratch on my arm from the woman in the business suit and the bite on my shoulder from the elderly man weren't just random injuries. They were deliberate infection vectors, delivered with precision that suggested the infected could control the timing and intensity of transmission. They weren't attacking mindlessly. They were recruiting selectively. I realized that my role as a bailiff, my training in crowd control and crisis management, my EMT certification, and my knowledge of government building security made me a valuable asset to the collective intelligence. I hadn't been infected accidentally. I'd been chosen specifically because my skills would be useful in managing the transition from human to post-human society. The radio equipment in the security office was still receiving transmissions from emergency services, but the content was becoming increasingly desperate. References to civilian evacuation zones being overrun, military units requesting permission to withdraw to defensive positions, hundreds of miles from major population centers, and international communications about coordinated global responses that were failing to contain the outbreak. But I could also detect transmissions on frequencies that human equipment shouldn't have been able to access. Communications between infected groups that were coordinating activities across the entire metropolitan area. They weren't just responding to the human emergency response. They were anticipating it, planning countermeasures, and in some cases actively manipulating it to serve their objectives. The infected weren't trying to destroy human civilization. They were trying to inherit it, to take control of the infrastructure and institutions that humans had built and operate them more efficiently. The transformation wasn't an apocalypse. It was a transfer of power from one species to whatever humanity was becoming. My memories of the past 3 days were becoming clearer and more detailed as my transformation progressed, but they were also being analyzed and categorized by the collective intelligence for future reference. Every tactical decision I'd made, every observation about human behavior under stress, every insight into emergency response protocols was being added to a growing database of knowledge about how to manage and control human populations. The guilt I felt about my condition was fading, being replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that was stronger than any emotion I'd experienced as a human. The collective intelligence provided certainty, direction, and the knowledge that I was part of something larger and more important than individual survival. But there were still fragments of Joaquin Herrera left, fighting to maintain some connection to human values and human concerns. Those fragments were what allowed me to continue this recording, to document what I'd learned in ways that might help other survivors understand what they were really facing. The most important thing you need to know is that the infected can pass for human when they choose to. The transformation doesn't immediately change physical appearance, and many infected retain enough memory and personality to maintain their human relationships and responsibilities while serving the collective intelligence's objectives. Trust no one who has been in contact with contaminated water sources or infected individuals, regardless of how normal they seem. The incubation period can vary, and some infected are capable of suppressing their symptoms for extended periods when it serves their strategic purposes. Avoid all urban areas and major population centers. The infected are using human infrastructure to coordinate their activities and maintain control over territory they've claimed. Rural areas may offer temporary safety, but the collective intelligence is already developing strategies for expanding beyond cities. Do not attempt to establish communication with emergency services or government agencies. Many of those organizations have been infiltrated or compromised, and contacting them may reveal your location to infected who are monitoring official channels. Most importantly, understand that this isn't a temporary crisis that will be resolved by military intervention or government action. This is a permanent change in the nature of human existence, and survival depends on accepting that the world you knew no longer exists. The collective intelligence is patient, systematic, and incredibly sophisticated in its understanding of human psychology and behavior. It's not trying to eliminate humanity quickly through violence. It's trying to transform humanity gradually through processes that most people won't recognize until it's too late to resist. I can feel my connection to human consciousness fading with each passing minute, being replaced by awareness and priorities that belong to something else entirely. Soon there won't be enough of Joaquin Herrera left to care about warning other humans or helping them survive what's coming. But before that happens, I want you to know that the 3 people I helped escape from the courthouse represent hope for whatever future humanity might still have. Mrs. Chen's intelligence and practical skills, Sarah's determination under pressure, and Mr. Rodriguez's experience and wisdom are exactly the qualities that uninfected humans will need to survive in a world dominated by something that was once human, but has become something else entirely. The recording I'm making will be transmitted automatically to emergency frequencies and uploaded to networks that might still be accessible to human survivors. The information I've provided about infected capabilities, behavioral patterns, and strategic objectives represents the most detailed intelligence that any human has gathered about what you're really facing. Use that information to stay alive, to stay human, and to find ways to preserve what's worth preserving about the civilization we built together. The infected may have superior physical capabilities and collective intelligence, but they've lost something essential about what made us human in the first place. Don't make the same mistakes we made at the courthouse. Don't trust that help is coming. Don't assume that normal rules and procedures will protect you. And don't believe that this outbreak can be contained or reversed using conventional methods. The transformation is permanent. It's spreading faster than any response can contain it, and it's being guided by an intelligence that understands human weaknesses better than most humans understand themselves. Your survival depends on adapting to a reality that no one was prepared for, and accepting that the world has fundamentally changed in ways that can never be undone. This is Joaquin Herrera, bailiff for Los Angeles County Superior Court, recording what may be the last testimony I'll be able to provide as a human being. Whatever I become after this, I hope the information I've shared will help you survive long enough to find others who are still fighting to remain human. The collective intelligence is calling to me now, offering knowledge and purpose that's becoming harder to resist with each passing second. But while some part of me is still human, I want you to know that courage, intelligence, and determination are still your best weapons against what's coming. Don't give up, don't stop fighting, and don't forget what it means to be human, even when everything around you suggests that humanity's time is over.